Alrighty, so the fourth and final part of our class on video game design is aesthetics or the dramatic elements, whichever you prefer. So I found this image of the evolution of Link from Zelda, and I really enjoyed it because it just kind of showed how video game art has evolved through time. I know a lot of us kind of remember a lot of these different stages too. And what's also interesting about this to me is that it's not purely linear or unidirectional. Like you're not just moving from to more levels of detail. You can see intentional stylistic decisions at times. Like the second to the last one is cell shaded and significantly less detailed, perhaps, than what was technically feasible for the artists and the game designers. Kind of like Paper Mario and things like that. It's not always true that you want the best, highest resolution graphics or what have you. There's definitely stylistic decisions that are made from time to time with game art. And that's kind of what we're going to touch on pretty briefly today. There's not a whole lot to say about this topic, to be completely honest, from my perspective, and that's just because I'm not an artist. A good video game artist could probably talk for hours and hours on this topic, and it would be fascinating. But things I'm going to be able to cover are just kind of the high level, how you use art and how it impacts your game decisions. So just a word about coherence. This is the same graphic I used last time, but I still like it a lot. It's kind of taking a look at how the designer looks from the inside out and the player looks from the outside in. So aesthetics affects the coherence of the game. If you don't have the right aesthetics, it's going to feel wrong. If you've got a game that's about rescuing people, rescuing things, but the game has this very violent graphics, it's just not going to feel right potentially. There's ways that the aesthetics can be at odds with the mechanics.
Do you have an example of a game that feels wrong because of the aesthetics?
That's a good point. I should have tried to think of a better example when I was putting together, or an example when I was trying to put together this presentation. I don't think it's ever something that's so overt that you're just like, oh, this is wrong. Like the player is never going to say, this is wrong. It's never going to be something that's like in the forefront of their mind. But I think that when you have, let me return to that question when I show you some of the art from one of the games I'm working on right now. And I'll explain some of the process that we went through to get to that kind of art.
Okay.
And maybe that'll kind of answer the question for you. It's a few slides down the road, though. So, 2D art. Good old two-dimensional Mario. This is kind of what I mean, too, about the fact that there is, it's art and aesthetic decisions aren't strictly visual. They're not just what it looks like. They also impact how the game plays a little bit. Obviously, 2 dimensions work differently than 3 dimensions. So there's a little bit of a blending between the aesthetic and some of the formal mechanics of the game. You can't design in silos. You can't say like, I finished the formal, now I'm going to go do the aesthetic. You can't switch a game at the last minute from 2D to 3D or something like that and still have it feel right. 2.5D is sometimes called isometric. It's kind of one that I like a lot. This is actually the video game that I talked about last time that I played a lot in my childhood. It's called Ultima Online. So maybe for that reason it holds a special place in my heart. But it's that kind of 3/4 top view where things are, you're not looking at it front on. It's like 45 degrees rotated both to the right and upwards from ground level. So you're kind of looking at a 3/4 angle down at the characters. And it gives this sense of dimension, even though the characters themselves are all 2-dimensional sprites. Like if you take apart Ultima Online, as I did, you'll find that each one of these things is actually a 2-dimensional sprite. You have it for the arm of the player as it's facing left or as it's facing down. It's not a 3D modeled, rendered model, which is what we get in full 3D, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. No real introduction needed there for 3-dimensional art, except to say, again, to my earlier point, it's not always the right decision. I wish I would have included, I just realized that something is worth talking about here. You guys heard of the Uncanny Valley?
Yes.
Yeah. Explain it?
Yeah, I did some graphic stuff when I was in college. So the uncanny valley is this theory that the closer you get to reality in graphics, the more people like associate with the characters until you get to the uncanny valley, where you're previously when you were very far away from what real life actually looks like, people would like anthropomorphize these like things that are obviously not real. But once you get to like the point where it's pretty close to looking real, people, instead of noticing the similarities, there are so many similarities that all they notice are the differences, and so it like freaks them out, and they view it as like uncanny looking.
Yeah.
And so there's like this dip, and then it comes back up where it's like, okay, now it just looks like real life or whatever.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google it real quick just so you can see a chart of exactly what was just described there. It's a fascinating effect. Let's see. Yeah, Wikipedia's got a good entry on it. The uncanny valley right there, right before, as the robot or as the art becomes more and more and more realistic looking, as you were saying, just before it becomes perfectly realistic looking, the brain starts to expect more of how it acts. So if anything is off, the brain will pick up on it. And it is freaky. It is like things are going well, but then you'll just have this gut feeling of like, this thing is wrong. This thing's an alien. It just, you have like a visceral reaction to it. And then you could climb out of the valley and all of a sudden things feel good again. Curious if they have a good example.
Oh, yeah, wait, I think that's actually like, if you blow up that image, that's actually like
the robot.
Yeah.
I thought that was actual image for a minute.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's
kind of freaky that all you notice is what's off.
Yeah, exactly. It's like right at that point we're like, oh, so close yet so far away.
That's like the struggle that games and movies have with doing realistic flesh and eyes. Like,
yeah,
you have the shape and everything, but there's something about the way the light hits skin that like you just know that something's off. You don't exactly know what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good like. You can tell that that's just like, what is that?
Yeah, you just feel wrong looking at that, and yet it's so close. Like objectively, that's probably one of the best photorealistic implementations of a human face I've ever seen in terms of actual physical objects, and yet emotionally, that feels wrong to me. Yeah, here's another chart, cute, creepy. That's actually that one seems to sum it up pretty well. I like it. And what's relevant about this to game design is that the uncanny valley doesn't just happen from pure aesthetics. It also happens from an AI level. You start attributing more and more human characteristics to something as it becomes more and more human looking. So just as your expectations of those little blemishes get higher and higher, so does your expectation of how it moves and walks and talks and acts. And you know, if it acts really dumb and even if it looks great, you hold it to a higher standard. You can kind of forgive a crappy looking piece of artwork for acting dumb. But when something looks perfectly human, if it acts dumb, you just psychologically you don't like it. It's like, this is stupid, or you know, I don't want to interact with it.
So does the uncanny valley only or predominantly apply to the aesthetics, or can it also apply to like the physics or the scenario? Like for instance, I've always noticed that I have an internal dialogue when I watch certain 3D movies about, you know, let's say you watch the Avengers, you see the Hulk, and he smashes something, and you know his size, but it's like he'll fall on something and it doesn't break the way you think it should. It's like, and your internalizer going, wait, he's so many pounds, it should turn to dust. And you're like, wait a minute, this is a 3D movie. Why am I arguing the physics in my head? But
right.
That's kind of where you're like, is that kind of like the uncanny valley also, where you're like attributing like actual world physics to a scenario, or is it only aesthetics?
You know, I think it sounds similar, but I think the uncanny valley is very specifically about humans, just because we know them so well, and we kind of attribute human personality traits. It's really that visceral ugh reaction that the uncanny valley is about. Though I completely agree with you that you can be watching, or for me, I can be watching the most out there sci-fi with all the suspension of disbelief in the world, and then see something where I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, the aliens, fine, sure, whatever. But that explosion in space, the fact that there was sound in space, oh god, noobs.
That's hilarious. There's got to be a term for that.
Yeah. Neil deGrasse Tyson would pick it apart.
Oh, he sure would.
Anyway, moving on. So this whole class, I mean, we could continue breaking down different stuff. For like, there's pixel art, which is sometimes called retro art. Flappy Bird kind of fell into this genre. It's, in the old days, we had very limited amount of graphics capabilities and memory and so on and so forth. So we were very, very conservative with how we designed our characters. And these days we can get by with a lot more. But there's a whole kind of genre and nostalgia for those days, especially amongst people who actually grew up with the original Game Boys and things like that for retro games. Shading's kind of interesting. Just from the perspective of game art, you can... there's a lot of different ways to get to that aesthetic end goal, whatever you're looking for. And this is kind of one of the interesting examples to me, what they're calling a toon shader here. You might also call a cell-shaded character or whatnot. That thing on the right is a 3D model, which has been rendered with Maya or 3D Studio Max or whatever. And then they used a shader within the 3D rendering program. Yet, at the same time, you could have done something like that purely 2D, starting with pencil and paper and coloring it in Illustrator. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of approach art sometimes. Interesting example of this is South Park and other kind of comic-y shows like that these days are actually done in full 3D rendering programs. They're no longer pieces of cardboard cut out paper or whatever. They actually render full 3D objects and then or rather model full 3D objects and then render them into 2D scenes.
Yeah, where they composite them in After Effects.
Oh, interesting.
And same thing for Archer. They have one company that does all the backgrounds. They do them all in 3D render, toon shade them, and then they said they do all the characters. They bring actual people in with the clothes on, so they can do the exact same, and everything is like 3D toon shaded.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
They composite it in AE, and I was like, why would you do After Effects? So I guess that makes sense. But
yeah. Yeah, I would be kind of interested to see what one of those TV shows looked like without the toon shader.
I know. That would be awesome. That would be awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so this is actually some of the latest artwork for the game that I've been working on, and this just came from the artist, and I wanted to talk a bit about materials here, and this is what we were talking about a second ago, Reem, about things feeling wrong. We spent a lot of time kind of experimenting with what the right material was for the UI and UX components here. So I should make a distinction. We have game artwork as it pertains to like characters and world objects, buildings, plants, characters, terrains, etc. Those are the things in the world. But then there's also UI, which is like this dialogue box that you can see. It's something you interact with. It has buttons on it, and things like that. So and this is what I mean, that like if this were made out of some really shiny metal, it wouldn't feel right for the game. And that would be really overt. The player would catch on to that immediately. He's like, why is this like woodsy elfish character embedded within a titanium metal frame? It would feel completely off. But then there's just shades of wrongness that you can achieve if you don't think about things well. I'm pretty happy with how this wood dialogue turned out, but there's, maybe we want to use different materials for different races because there's 5 different races in the game, things like that. It's, like I said, shades of wrongness and also shades of rightness, which is just like with the Uncanny Valley, or with like getting closer and closer to correctness or whatever, you might start to find that tweaking the material or tweaking some aspect of the art can all of a sudden just make everything feel better. Not that the art itself was better, but the game just feels more coherent. So, like these ribbons actually might be an interesting example. It's something that we're still working on within the art of the game, and I think that it'll be kind of interesting to see where we end up with the ribbons, because I'm kind of presently of the opinion that we need to tweak them a little bit. They don't feel quite right to me.
Yeah, when you just talked about the wood and the woodsman, one of the things that I thought of is, if not that top ribbon, but where it says taunt, something in there could also be like a leather, like looking like a belt. Could the leather and the wood tie in nicely with them? Yeah,
leather, like the ribbon is, I think about it super logically, which for me is like, why do we have ribbons in an era in which we were wood and elf and leaves and things like that? Because that's what you're telling me by this wooden dialogue. Right. You're saying that we live in this, pre-industrial era here in this video game world. Right. So yeah, I like that idea of like a leather or something like that. That would make more sense for this context. And yeah, that's exactly it. Like, it's very hard to isolate something like that. Just looking at this, it took me a long time to realize that it was the ribbons that were bothering me when I looked at it, personally at least. And once I thought about it enough, it was kind of easier to articulate that. It's like, oh, of course, ribbons don't fit with wood necessarily. Anyway. Second half of this that goes hand in hand with the aesthetics are the sound effects and music. Just kind of breeze through this relatively quickly. I wish I had one of my music or sound effect designer friends here, because they could talk about this much better. But sound effects are like that part of video games that nobody ever seems to remember, but everybody probably should do a better job of. They have a lot of power. The music can cause you to become nervous. It can instill emotions in you. I mean, you can find study after study after study. Just Google like emotional impact of music on the internet, and you will find so much about how music changes or instills emotions in us. And that's exactly what you want when you're designing a video game. If you're designing a horror video game, you want people to feel nervous or kind of on edge when they're walking into that room where the zombie's gonna jump out or something. And by the same token, if you've played Mario, I can almost guarantee that you can hear this in your head right now. Like anybody who's played Mario can hear that pentatonic, it's wonderful. It is something that you associate with success. And that is very important for the game, not just because you can use it for learning triggers, like you can reinforce learned behaviors as you throw in sound effects for things, but also because, again, that kind of emotional component and as you're running towards that flag, some part of you is going, I'm about to get it, I'm about to get it. And that reward is not just the points, it's not just the stars and the glitter, it's also the sound effects and the whole sensory experience. Adaptive music is pretty interesting. Something that is done in a lot of games now. Basically, it's just saying that it kind of adjusts for what's happening in the game and is a cross-fading between different musical scores. So as you step into battle, the game will automatically start transitioning into faster tempoed music that kind of gets your heart racing a little bit. And as you leave, you go into a peaceful area, it'll start cross-fading into that. So it's kind of a hybrid of programming and musical design. It requires a certain degree of thought. You have to think about how to blend your songs together so that they don't sound completely jilted and kind of like you're just skipping from one track to another. But when done correctly, it can feel really nice. I mean, it's this consistent ambient progression of the world that really reflects what's happening in your mind. And then there's whole sound-based games. Beat Sneak Bandit is the picture here that I'm showing, which is an iPhone, iPad game. I think it might be iPad only. And it's a game that's you have to play with music on, really. Like, there's practically no way to play it without headphones or at least speakers, I suppose, because the game is about timing things based upon the music. And there's lots of other good examples too. I mean, obviously Rock Band is all about the music.
What's the name of that game?
Beat Sneak Bandit. Yeah, it's a fun little game. It's won lots and lots of awards. There's some other really, really good ones, like I think Groove Coaster on the iPhone. There's an iPad game that I think is called Pulse, not to be confused with the. You familiar with it?
Yeah, I think I played it back in, like, it's a couple years old now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember it that much, but I remember the game.
Yeah, it's well, I'll describe it real quick. It's a very, very simple, beautiful UI. It's just a black background, and there's like a circle at the center, and you're basically trying to tap on different beats as they expand from the screen. And you have to do it rhythmically, and you have to use multiple fingers to hit the beats at the right time. It's incredibly addictive, actually. I found it to be extremely enjoyable. It's actually probably one of my favorite iPhone iPad games. Not to be confused, though, with Pulse, the news reading app. That's really it. Like I said, I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said about aesthetics and dramatic elements of game design, but that's really all I can intelligibly speak about. Anybody want to throw any questions in here before we kind of wrap up the actual lesson parts of all this?
I think so.
Yeah, you good? Cool. That's it then.